Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. On today's episode, I'm joined by Bennett Parten, Assistant Professor of History at Georgia Southern University, to discuss his book, Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. The book tells the story of Sherman's march through the South as a social history of the refugee crisis brought on by the war and the Emancipation Proclamation. As freed slaves rushed toward the Union forces, they brought with them challenges and opportunities that helped end the war and shape Reconstruction. Here's our conversation from April 17th, 2025.
My name is Bennett Parten. I am an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University, and I'm the author of the new book, Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March, and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation.
Well, thank you for joining the conversation we have here, and I would love for you to begin by telling us how Sherman's March began to fascinate you, where that started to come into your consciousness, and what you learned while writing the book.
All right, yeah, sure. So as I've been going around talking about the book, I've got two answers for this question. One a longer answer and one maybe a shorter answer. And the longer answer goes back to the fact that I was born in Athens, Georgia. I grew up in Royston, Georgia, which is just north of Athens. And every year my family would come down to where I live now in Savannah, Hilton Head on the coast of South Carolina, St. Simons in Georgia, and others, a couple times a year, 3-4 times maybe, to go to the beach. And on that trip down, for all of it, except maybe the first 30 minutes of it, you are on the path of Sherman's March. And then two, when we got down here, as much as I enjoyed playing golf, fishing, sitting on the beach, what I really like to do is drive around and explore the low country. And so I think there was a part of me that always relished the idea of telling a history that combined these two places that mean so much to me, right? The low country, and then especially my home state of Georgia. And so I'd like to think that the book started there, right, with my own biography, my own memories. But the book really started for me while reading a work of fiction. Some of your readers may be familiar with E.L. Doctorow. They may know the book The March. Doctorow, I think, is unquestionably one of our great fiction writers, full stop, definitely one of our great historical fiction writers. He's especially known for Ragtime, which is a great book about America at the turn of the 20th century. But he also wrote a fictional account of Sherman's March called simply The March. And as Doctorow tended to do, he wrote with a wide cast of characters. Innumerable different characters are featured in the book. But one of his characters is a freed woman by the name of Wilma Jones, who drops everything, runs to the army, and then follows the army all the way to Savannah. You later find out that she's the mother of another character of one of Doctorow's books, but I'm not going to spoil that or go any further. But it occurred to me that Wilma Jones was likely not a singular character, that she was a composite character. And there were likely many hundreds, if not thousands, of Wilma Joneses who followed the army. And so the book really started with this question of, can we tell the story of Wilma Jones and folks like her as a work of history and not historical fiction? And in some ways, I always viewed myself as writing a kind of nonfiction handbook to Doctorow's fictional account. And so the book for me really began there, being drawn in by reading fiction. And then I think the thing you mentioned, what I learned along the way, one of the things that I learned early on that told me that I had a story here, and that there was a story to tell about the men and women who ran to the army and then followed the army, was when I learned just how large of a movement this was. When Sherman arrives in Savannah, he speculates that there are as many as 20,000 refugees from slavery, 20,000 Wilma Joneses who had arrived outside of Savannah with his army. Not only is 20,000 a third of his overall army in Georgia, which is an astounding number, that is almost the size of Savannah itself, and it's double the size of Atlanta. And so we're talking about a movement, right, that's the size of what in Savannah was a large southern city, and then Atlanta, right, is now, the metropolis here in the state of Georgia. And so it's when I learned that I realized, okay, there's a story to tell here. This is a really big movement, and it's really important for us to understand the weight and the significance of this movement in full.
Well, thank you for that. And I think I would like to begin um, your story here with just what was Sherman's March for those who may have forgotten from history class. I mean, I know volumes have been written on every aspect of what happened during it, but just an overview of kind of what Sherman did and why it was so important to the overall Northern war project.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. Sherman's March to the Sea, also known as the Savannah Campaign, begins in mid-November of 1864. This is the last full year of the Civil War, though it's not quite clear that's going to be the case just yet. Though there's some expectations that might be true. And it is Sherman's next move after taking the city of Atlanta. And the march is a really important moment because the war is beginning to dwindle down, but there is an effort to provide what you could call sort of the knockout punch to the Confederacy. And that is in part what Sherman designs to do in making this march. He could have gone any number of different places, but one of his goals was to take Savannah and then begin angling back up through the Carolinas to meet Grant in Virginia. But when he makes this march, he makes the sets the deliberate expectations that his men would forage off the farms and fields of Georgia, both to sustain his army because he had to cut his supply lines outside and leaving Atlanta. But he's also very deliberate. This was an attempt to target the emotional and material wherewithal of white Southerners who were still keeping up the fight. He's got this great letter that he writes to Grant where he basically says that this to him is statecraft or statesmanship by other means, right? It's proving that the power of the federal government is absolute in this moment and that there is no more ability for the Confederate States to resist it. So he's very clear about this. And certainly the way the march has long been remembered has focused on the nature of the campaign. I can say as a native Georgian, someone who's lived in Georgia most of my entire life, the memory of Sherman's March still lives deep in the cultural memory of the state. And then two, historians have long looked at Sherman's tactics and have questioned whether or not this was a early instance of total war, meaning was this Sherman enacting a new modern form of war, the equivalent to what we'll see later in the First World War, Second World War, Vietnam, you name it. Short answer is no. There's a lot we can talk about there. But nonetheless, these are some of the reasons that the march has always been really important, both in terms of the Civil War and the way it played out, but also in the way that we as Americans and historians argue about it and remember it.
Yeah, and you did allude to the fact that this was a massive undertaking. I mean, I think it was 60,000 men, and it was
Mhm.
a tremendous. I think you described it in the book as saying like there were like three different segments of the march. And then I really want to focus on the freed people and how they got there.
Sure.
You can kind of explain first how you organized the march and why it was such a massive undertaking, and then you add this other massive undertaking as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, massive is the right word. I mean, Sherman actually divides some of his army in Atlanta. So it was a smaller force than what took Atlanta, but it's still 60,000 soldiers, and maybe a little bit more, maybe something around 62,000 when all is said and done. It's a huge number. And the way he made this march was he divided his army into two wings, a left wing and a right wing. And then within both of those wings, there were two separate columns. So there were essentially four columns marching through Georgia. And the left wing and the right wing, if anyone knows Georgia or has driven through Atlanta, it essentially followed I-75 south of Atlanta before turning towards Savannah around Macon, and then following I-20 east from Atlanta before angling down to Savannah, I-20 heading towards Augusta, towards the east. So that's basically the route that the two different wings take. But as a moving force, this was a span of soldiers that fanned out maybe 30 miles through Georgia. They meet very little resistance, and they're moving very quickly. So this is really a massive wave of humanity. You add into the fact that they are foraging for their food. You add in the fact they are meeting some, though very slight resistance from the planters and from plantation owners themselves, right? Add in the fact that as they are moving, enslaved people are also fleeing to them. And as Sherman speculates, maybe it's 20,000, which brings the number up, right, to 80,000 people moving through the state of Georgia in the span of a month and a half, right, covering maybe 5 to 15 miles a day. So this is a quick process. It is a fast moving army that is of extraordinary size. And if not to interrupt you, but if I just add in that, one of the things they're doing while they're foraging is they're often the soldiers, that is, lighting not houses but cotton houses on fire. So there is smoke on the horizon, and then there is light resistance in the form of actual Confederate military. There is a Confederate cavalry force that is hovering around the soldiers at all times. That just kind of adds to the chaos and the confusion and this massive wave of humanity.
Yeah, and I want to talk about some of the things that faced Sherman first as a general. So he's marching his army through the South here, and as he's doing that, he's getting these commands from Washington, Lincoln's administration, as to what to do with this massive humanity who's fleeing to his army. And I mean, he's not in the business of refugee encampment. He's in the business of waging war. So what's the progression of his acceptance of these refugees, basically the freed people who were flocking to his army for safety and support?
Yeah. It's complicated, to say the least. Sherman is the great villain of the South, but the irony there is that despite being from Ohio, he was kind of a Southerner. After leaving for West Point, he vowed never return to Ohio for longer than a visit. He spent a significant amount of time at Charleston as a young cadet. He had lived in New Orleans before. He lived in St. Louis. And before the war begins, he's actually in Alexandria, Louisiana, as the head of a military college, an upstart military college that is the forerunner of today's LSU. And while he's there, he is very sad to see the Civil War come because he's trying to make a career for himself. He's made lots of friends who are Southerners. He has the same racial views as many of them. In fact, at one point, he tells, I believe it's his brother, that his views on slavery were good enough for this country. This country meaning the South, for Louisiana, not the U.S. more broadly. So when the war begins, he retains many of these same ideas. And he's very clear that for him, emancipation, slavery, has no place in this conflict. It is first and foremost a conflict about the nation's integrity. It's about the power of the federal government to put down a rebellion and nothing more. And he insists that slavery and emancipation should be kept separate from the overall purpose of the war. Nonetheless, the war unfolds and it evolves. And he finds himself in these positions of having to govern and manage emancipation as it's happening around his army. The first place this happens for him is in Memphis when he is the military governor of the city in 1862. And he's there in the year where the Second Confiscation Act is passed, which is Congress's first attempt, or really it's the sort of preview of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that'll come in September. So he's there happening when the legislation of emancipation and emancipation policy is being born. And he wants nothing to do with it. He thinks that it's only going to add more problems for his army. He thinks it is something that is ideological only, right? It's not a practical thing for him and his army to actually do. And he sees it as only leading to real problems, and he sees it as being essentially a drag on the war effort. And he, quite frankly, keeps this position all the way through the Civil War. Though he does, and I want to be very clear when I say this, he does slightly evolve by the time the march begins, and that may be being a little bit charitable. But what I mean is, he, at this point, now recognizes that targeting slavery is a way to win the war, and it is a way to target the Confederacy. He's evolved on that score. He also has begun to realize and recognize that styling himself as a liberator is good for him politically. This is something that he can use and really wear as a kind of badge of honor when it comes to fending off his critics, so on and so forth. but even then, right, his main purpose is still to the army and not in seeing emancipation be enacted, followed through in the most broadest sense. And I think the best kind of way to understand that is as part of his official campaign orders for the march, he includes a brief order about what to do with the refugees who come into his lines. I'm going to paraphrase him, but he says something along the lines of the fact that freed people may be taken along if they are able-bodied and able to care for themselves, meaning men primarily. But then he says, but every officer should recognize that their top priority is their own soldiers and the question of supply. And this order to me is really interesting because I think it doesn't really say much, for one. It's very ambiguous, not really a clear order by any means. But I think more than anything, right, it assumes that it's going to be the army who determines what emancipation is going to look like. But the reality is that enslaved people are going to begin fleeing to the army and running to the army in such massive numbers that that is not going to be the case, that they're going to have a real say-so in what emancipation will look like as this campaign unfolds.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of the how maybe Sherman's ideas don't change that much, but it sounded like some of the troops who were fighting in his army got to see some of the horrors of and the violence of slavery, and they also were aided on these foraging missions by the enslaved before they were, coming to liberation in his ranks. So, could you talk about how the refugees themselves started to impact kind of attitudes and what was going on within the army itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's worth pointing out that Sherman's army was an army mostly of Midwesterners. There were very few New England or really sort of mid-Atlantic or East Coast regiments, we might say today. It was mostly regiments from Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, the Midwestern states. Many of them had never seen slavery, didn't know much about slavery. Many of them were first, if not second generation immigrants, right? There are a lot of diaries that I discovered still written in German, that sort of thing. So this was a new experience for many of them. And many of them certainly shared and possessed the prejudices of most 19th century Americans at that time. I mean, racial prejudice was not immune to northern states by any means. But nonetheless, you do see a sense of views changing. I mean, there is a range of opinion, but you can see views begin to change. Some in part because when the soldiers arrive in Georgia and make this march, they begin to realize that enslaved people themselves are their greatest allies. And they begin to recognize just how important enslaved people are to the overall success and workings of the army. Enslaved people worked as cooks, laundresses. They drove carriages. They served as valets, right? They did all sorts of work like that. And they also were critical to their success on the campaign, right? They served as intelligence agents, scouts. Sherman routinely asked for enslaved people to get a sense of the landscape, get a sense of where the cavalry had moved. And so the soldiers become aware of just how valuable some of this knowledge is and just how willing enslaved people were to help them. Someone else that I've been did a podcast with earlier jokingly described enslaved people as serving in effect of Sherman's fifth column. And that's kind of the way they operated in Georgia. Just as a few examples, one of the things that the soldiers were amazed by was the fact that, as was common throughout the South in advance of the army, many of the white Southerners basically hid their goods or buried their goods. Oftentimes, they would hide horses out in the woods or bury things in family cemetery. But of course, they didn't actually do the burying themselves. They ordered enslaved people to do it. So this armed enslaved people with extraordinary knowledge of where these things were, that they were quite willing to show the soldiers. And they were quite willing to sometimes use this as a bargaining chip to convince the soldiers to let them go along. And so this process of foraging, at least when it came to livestock, was in some ways a shared process that enslaved people were helping the soldiers with. There's another great story or example about when the march reaches the outskirts of Savannah. Or at least the left wing, reaches the kind of northern neck of the Savannah River. This is an area that is kind of what we know down here as the old Savannah River rice swamps. It's now the port in Savannah. It's very marshy ground. The plantations there were not as abundant. Had already been picked over, and they grew mostly rice instead of cotton. And this was a moment where the march had come to a crawl, and there was a real question about whether or not the foraging parties might come back empty-handed, and maybe the army would stall out, maybe the soldiers would go hungry. But they didn't, because enslaved people taught them how to cook rice. They shared with them their rice harvest. They showed them how to use a mortar and pestle. And so for these few five, half a week, maybe a week there before the army entered Savannah, Georgia's enslaved population essentially sustained the army. And then just one other example of how critical enslaved people were to the Army's success is that oftentimes enslaved people either joined to work as pioneers or sometimes were impressed as pioneers. This is a term used to describe military laborers in general. But on the march, they were essentially road builders. They went out ahead of the army and they prepared the road for the coming columns. Which leaves us with the image of the fact that as Sherman's army is moving through Georgia, there are scores of enslaved people who are literally out in front of the army, basically paving the way for the army's approach to Savannah, which again, I think just underscores how critical enslaved people were to the army's success.
Yeah, and you make a really good argument in the book for you explore the chaos of what it must have been like to be left behind on a plantation as all the white planters leave, slave population is still there, technically still enslaved because they're still Southern, whatever. And the decision that these individuals had to make about whether to weather the storm in place or to pick up roots and rush towards the Union Army. Could you explain that thinking and some of the things that went into that decision?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This decision to follow the army was a really difficult one. And so that's a really good thing to say maybe about that 20,000 number, which is that it is an extraordinarily large number, but it does not take into account the people who might have run to the army, followed the army, but then turned back on their own volition or were turned back by the soldiers themselves. It doesn't take into account the people who ran to the army, talked to the army about going, but then ultimately didn't make that decision. It doesn't take into effect the many thousands of people who became free just as a consequence of this movement, right? So as big as that 20,000 number is, it does not tell the full story. And there are many folks, right, who didn't make the journey, who nonetheless went through the process of trying to make this decision of whether or not to follow the army. And it was an extraordinarily complicated one. First of all, they had to question whether or not they could actually physically make this journey. There's no stated endpoint at this point. The assumption is Savannah, maybe. But can you physically make this march? Sometimes this would be easier if people had access to a carriage or a horse, but many of these people did it on foot in the middle of winter, which Georgia doesn't get as cold as Ohio, but especially that time of year, there's gonna be a lot of heavy rain. It can be kind of nasty down here with the ocean so close. So they had to, ask these questions about themselves physically. They also had to ask questions about family. Would they be leaving loved ones? They had to ask questions about what happened if they did leave. Would there be some sort of retribution if they ever had to come back for some reason? So there are a whole host of different calculations that had to be made that went into whether or not someone would make this journey to Savannah. But people did make it, and oftentimes they were really quite clear about the reasons they were leaving. And for as many people who might have stayed behind to keep family together, there are many others who also left in the idea that they were going to search for family, or they thought that maybe they could reunite with family, which did happen. It happened, throughout the march. Not a lot, but we do have a handful of really poignant, powerful examples. They were also leaving because for the first time they could actually move, right? And there was freedom found in just simple idea of motion. They also followed the army in part because the army provided security. And there are all these different ways that enslaved people made this calculation, or there are all these different calculations that enslaved people made that points to the fact that they are envisioning, right, and beginning to put the different parts and pieces of freedom together in this moment. They are actively thinking about what their futures might look like and trying to act on it, while also weighing the very significant risk of what could be lost and what could be awaiting them at the end of this campaign. So it was a really complicated situation to have to parse through.
So we've already talked about some of the positive changes in attitudes for Sherman's army, but we have to talk now about Jefferson C. Davis.
That's right.
Some of the negative. I mean, obviously, there were a lot of rumors started by the South about the bad treatment of the Northern Army if you ran to them as a free person. But in this case, those rumors turned out to be horrifically true. So could you talk about Davis and just what he was doing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Jeff C. Davis is, I think, the undisputed villain of the story of the march. It's well deserved. And he's someone who had a reputation for this. Earlier in the war, he actually murdered in cold blood another U.S. general. And was able to get off, in part because there was such a need of having competent officers in the army. And he is one of Sherman's corps commanders. He is the head of the 14th Corps, which is part of the left wing. And it just so happens that his column is marching the closest to the Savannah River. He basically sort of does a feint towards Augusta and then starts angling south. And this matters because the Savannah, like many rivers, has a number of different tributaries. And so it's his route that is going to be covering the swampiest terrain. And he's going to be crossing the most, the greatest amount of rivers and streams as he's marching. And he is someone from southern Indiana who has pretty venomous views about race. He is a pre-war Democrat. Most of his men know this about him. He has, as I said, a well-earned reputation. And of all of Sherman's corps commanders, he is the one that I could find who, in writing, wrote back to Sherman complaining about the number of refugees who were following his columns and wanting to do something to stop them. And by the time his column gets about halfway through the march, he develops this practice, or he employs this practice of pulling up the temporary bridges that the army lays down to cross some of these streams before the refugees following his columns have a chance to cross. He does this once to no real effect. The refugees are able to most of them at least are able to get to the other side. There's some evidence that he does this a few other times at different stages in the march. And it's clear to all of his soldiers, at least, that to do this would essentially be handing the refugees over to Confederate cavalry, who would either kill them or re-enslave them on the spot. But nonetheless, he does this exact same trick, or he pulls this trick at a place called Ebenezer Creek, which is about 20 miles north of Savannah. And it's called Ebenezer Creek, but you have to understand this is really more of a intercoastal waterway connected to the Savannah River. Again, living out here in Savannah, these are very familiar to us, but it's really kind of a bayou or a swamp with a pretty fast current. And especially that time of year in the winter after heavy rains, the water level would have been high. And where the crossing was really close to where the creek comes into the Savannah River itself. So the current would have been faster. And he pulls this trick there. And as soon as he pulls the bridges up, some sources say that he burns them, though it's not clear if that's necessarily true or not, just for good measure. Confederate cavalry sweep up from behind, barrel into the refugees who are stranded on the bank. Many of them are either killed or re-enslaved. Others jump into the water. Some try to crawl under the bank for safety, run up and down the bank for safety. Many of the people who went into the water never returned. They were either killed by shots in the water, or drowned. Very few ever made it to the other side. after the chaos happening on the other side of the bank. And this is by far the darkest, most tragic moment of the march. And it is, I think, a sign, as you say, that for as many soldiers who were willing to help the refugees, there were still large numbers in Sherman's army, particularly in certain leadership positions like Davis, right, who did not want the refugees following them, and would go to links like this to check their advance.
Well, let's jump ahead to Savannah. The
Okay.
army gets there, they're met with almost no resistance, and they're going to winter there. One of the first things that happens is what to do with this tremendous amount of humanity that has walked into Savannah with them. So, could you explain to us some of the ideas that were floated around, especially the special field orders and this place called Port Royal, which was factored heavily into what could resettlement and things like that could mean?
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So maybe I'll take Port Royal first because it's got an interesting backstory. So Port Royal is on the South Carolina Sea Islands. I was actually not too far from there for lunch earlier today. It is kind of the classic South Carolina low country. It is maybe half an hour to an hour from Savannah by car, probably much closer by boat. Um, and it is the kind of center of a real island complex that is just north of Savannah. And Port Royal is important, especially early in the war, because it is the deepest deep water port on the southern coastline. And so, as part of the Army's and Navy's initial strategy for the war, they want to, and they do, take Port Royal and use Port Royal as a base to then launch the blockade of both Charleston and Savannah. It's kind of a way station, it's a depot, it's a base of operations for them. They do this in the fall of 1861, and when the Army and the Navy land, most of the region's white planters have all evacuated, and they've left behind about 10,000 enslaved people. These people are effectively free, but this is long before an Emancipation Proclamation. It's long before this evolution of emancipation policy. And so they aren't legally free. And it's a real question of what the government is going to do, how they're going to manage the situation. And thanks in part to Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, what is imagined is a program known as the Port Royal Experiment, where legions of Northern missionaries, agents, teachers, philanthropists, a few 19th century capitalists, technocrats arrive on the islands and do a whole host of humanitarian work, provide aid, build schools, uh, teach Sunday schools, hold religious services, but also critically force enslaved people back to work on the plantations, not as enslaved people, but as wage laborers. The Port Royal Experiment was supposed to be this humanitarian project that also began to transition the U.S. Out of slavery and into what they would describe as free labor or a free labor system. It has an incredibly complicated history through the war. I mean, you could write a whole book on it. There have been people who've written whole books on it. But it matters for this story because when Sherman pulls up to Savannah, and as he is approaching Savannah, even before he arrives, he's made the decision that when he can, he is going to transfer the refugees down the Ogeechee River, which is another one of these intercoastal waterways just south of Savannah, uh, into the Atlantic, up the coast of Port Royal, and essentially resettle them there, where presumably there is an infrastructure there to support them, right? It would be better than just living behind the army. But this is also, to some degree, in Sherman's own self-interest, because he is going to leave Savannah by the end of January, and he does not want the refugees following him anymore. And so his goal, right, is to relocate them and settle them at Port Royal. All the while, this process is happening. Sherman also in Savannah meets with 20 of Savannah's Black religious leaders. And he meets with them alongside Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And the meeting is held to basically discuss what to do with the Georgia freedmen, what to do with this looming situation in Savannah with all the refugees. Sherman's already started this process of transferring them to Port Royal. But what next, right? Is there a better solution out there? And so Sherman Stanton meet with these 20 Black religious leaders. There is one such leader, a man named Garrison Frazier, who's appointed the spokesman. And Frazier essentially holds court with Stanton and Sherman for the entire evening and outlines a vision for what freedom could look like that is rooted in land ownership. This is the best way that free people can take care of themselves is to be placed on land or given land until they can purchase it for themselves. And this is important because this becomes the basis of what is known as Sherman's Special Field Orders 15, which is an order he gives that sets aside confiscated Confederate plantation land from essentially Charleston in the north to Jacksonville in the south for exclusively Black homesteading. And Sherman only imagined this as a temporary expedient, but nonetheless, what this does, it suddenly turns the islands along the coast, with Port Royal as a kind of nucleus, turns it into the center of the U.S. government's attempt at land reform. And now suddenly, land reform is on the agenda for Reconstruction. And so land reform is approached in this aftermath of the march. But the story of Port Royal remains complicated in part because Port Royal becomes not only the nucleus of this attempt at land reform, but also it becomes essentially the site of a refugee crisis. And there's significant hunger, a lack of housing, and a pretty rapid spread of disease. So the story takes a real dark turn as the refugees arrive in South Carolina.
Yeah, yeah, and I did want to just kind of talk a little bit more about the Port Royal. What happens to the fact that it gets sold and that whole mess? Because I think what that, as you say in the book, it's a real dress rehearsal for Reconstruction, and just how there is this desire to solve a problem, but then there's also this other desire to like make sure that it isn't a full solution. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But
yeah, sure. No, I mean that's part of the story of Port Royal. Even before Sherman arrived in Savannah, it has its own 3 years worth of history that is extraordinarily complicated. And as the great book on Port Royal describes it, it's a book called Rehearsal for Reconstruction. Port Royal really is a kind of precursor to, is a kind of testing ground for a lot of the questions of what that will go on to dominate Reconstruction. Most immediately is the question of labor. The enslaved people who are at Port Royal are being made to work cotton, but they don't want to work cotton. Cotton only has a market value. They would rather grow sweet potatoes, corn, beans, things that sustain themselves and their families. But so many of the agents who arrived on the islands were fairly doctrinaire in their vision of transitioning from slavery to freedom, that they were insistent that freed people essentially be taught how to work for a wage. And how to do that, how does the market work? Well, the market only works for cotton. And so we can see, right, this question of labor becoming a real source of tension. Land is the other one. There is belief amongst those agents that the ultimate course and outcome of the Port Royal experiment is that the enslaved people would be granted land. Land would be divided up and allocated to them. But there is this tricky legal issue, which is that that land had not been, the taxes on it had not been paid to the federal government because these were Confederates who'd fled, right? They no longer are part of the federal government. And so legally, that land had to be sold at a public auction. And what ends up happening is that small numbers of freed people are able to pool their money and actually purchase land. Some of that money is set aside for the project to still continue. But then large numbers of agents themselves, and one in particular, a man named Edward Philbrick, buys up essentially his own little fiefdom on the islands. And he is someone who believes that enslaved people should not be given land or be allowed to preemptively purchase land, but instead should have to take part in the marketplace like everyone else and essentially be prepared, right, and conditioned as free labor market thinkers. And so you can land as another sort of issue, right, where you can see these logics of the Port Royal experiment really coming into tension. But even at a more fundamental level than that, right, this is a project that is meant to provide humanitarian aid and lift people out of slavery, while also keeping the plantation system as its central unit intact. And that is a contradiction that will rear its head over and over again at Port Royal. And again, all this is happening before Sherman even arrives. And in some ways, when Sherman arrives in Savannah, he arrives at a time where morale on the islands is at a real low. And it's a question of whether or not the Port Royal experiment has been a great success or whether or not it's going to end in failure. And so the arrival of these refugees only compound some of these ongoing tensions that already exist there on the islands.
So, how long after Sherman leaves Atlanta does the war end, and we have Lincoln's assassination, and we have the beginning of Reconstruction? What happens in the March, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, so Sherman leaves Savannah in late January, January 21st, 22nd. An army that big, it moves out of a town like Beaufort in stages, right? So by late January, I say Beaufort. Sherman moved part of his army through Savannah to Beaufort, which is near Port Royal. The other part moved through Savannah through a place called Purrysburg in South Carolina. These are small places, and then the two armies converged. So there are different dates for when they actually left, but it's late January. And the next movement is a movement through South Carolina, through North Carolina, where Sherman and his army will fight a few final battles with a Joe Johnston-led Confederate army. He will force a Confederate surrender there. This is the second major surrender that happens after Appomattox. This is on April 22nd. Lee surrenders on the 9th. Lincoln is killed on the 12th, I believe, so just 3 days later. And then from there, Sherman will march his army to Washington, D.C. for the final Grand Review, which happens at the end of May. And Reconstruction begins on the islands really just as soon as Sherman leaves. There is attempts at land reform, at settling freed people on land up and down the coast. That happens in February, in March, throughout April and May. By the summer of 1865, I think the number is somewhere in the range of 40,000 people or families had been settled on about 400,000 acres of land, which is I think a real triumph given the circumstances. But then, of course, what happens is when Lincoln is assassinated, Johnson succeeds him. Over the course of 1865, he will begin the process of pardoning Confederates. Confederates will begin returning home. And that land that had been redistributed, families that had been settled on land will slowly be returned to the Confederates. And so we can see this effort at land reform really being undermined and reversed very shortly thereafter. But I still think it's important to recognize that in the same way that Port Royal becomes a kind of rehearsal for Reconstruction, that is only the case even further, right, when Sherman and the refugees arrive there on the coast. Now that land reform is on the table, these questions of land reform will then zoom out and become some of the questions that define Reconstruction all over the South. And then two, Sherman, one of Sherman's subordinates, Oliver Otis Howard, becomes the head of the Freedmen's Bureau. He models the Freedmen's Bureau based on some of the things he saw at Port Royal. And then two, the Freedmen's Bureau's land provisions is based almost wholly on Sherman's special field orders. And so in some ways, it is the presence of Sherman's army, it is the size of this refugee movement that puts the parts and pieces in place that sets up the early stages of what Reconstruction is going to look like. And just as a quick point about this, back in his meeting with the 20 Black religious leaders, Sherman is interviewing, or Stanton does most of the talking, the religious leaders. And there's a moment where Stanton asks Fraser, the spokesman, how has he come by his opinions? He's trying to feel Fraser out and see where he gets the authority to speak. And Fraser answers him by saying that basically he's come to his opinions through his ministry, and especially in his talks with the refugees, whose numbers surpass even his own expectation. which I think is a wonderful little admission and nugget of history, because what he essentially does is he traces, right, these dots of how this policy unfolds back to the presence of the refugees themselves and back to their own political visions. And they were not in the room in this moment, right? But nonetheless, through their movements behind the army, through their actions and pressuring the army and pushing the army and forcing the army to recognize them, they nonetheless sort of found a seat at the table and found a way to really impact what would come after. And again, so that's one of those little nuggets of history that you kind of cherish, when you do a book like this. And I think it only goes to underscore just how important Sherman's march was to the early stages of Reconstruction.
Well, thank you. That's a great place to stop. I do have one additional question. I don't know if it's fair to ask you, and if it is, we can include it. But how do you feel that the image and perception of Sherman's march has changed throughout the historical interpretation of it? Like, I found your undertaking of including kind of that conclusion that you just articulated hasn't always been the case, right? I mean, this refugee crisis isn't always talked about in Sherman's march and things like that. So, do you have a sense of how it's changed?
Yeah, so hopefully it's changing for the better. But no, I mean, certainly, I think the way that the marches has been remembered has been twofold, right? I mean, on the one hand, white Southerners have, always viewed the march with a sense of grievance for what Sherman did to us. I can say that perhaps as a native Georgian myself, right? That's usually the way that white Southerners have remembered this. But of course, this is in part a lost cause narrative, right? This fuels and is connected to the narratives of the lost cause. At the same time, historians have, as I said earlier, often focused exclusively on the military experience, in part because of this question of total war. But one of the things that we can see is that both of those different perspectives are mutually reinforcing, right? I mean, if Sherman was an instance of total war, it's look how devastating, right, the march was to white Southerners. So these are two different narratives that really are, in some respects, aligned. And I think both of those different narratives have, for a long time, kept the march in the kind of realm of Gone with the Wind, right? Has kind of kept it locked in place in a way that we often focus on either white Southerners or on the army. And we often define it or imagine it as a purely military experience. But I think by focusing on enslaved people, we can learn so much more about it. And there are, I think, two things that are maybe noteworthy to think about. I think the two big conclusions of the book, which is one, is that this was likely the largest emancipation event in American history. Just based on sheer numbers alone, it did what the Emancipation Proclamation only ever dreamed of doing, right, on paper, right? It did in effect what the document could only do on paper. And then two, I think we can see this as a defining moment in the history of American freedom, right? Put it right alongside Lincoln at Gettysburg, Philadelphia 1776, Selma in Alabama in 1965. It was a moment in which scores of enslaved people, thousands of enslaved people were imagining freedom and doing things to try to attain freedom and define freedom for themselves. Couple this with the way in which the march really, in some ways, opens the possibility for a wider reconstruction. I think only, I think solidifies it right even more, and only demonstrates even more just how important of a moment it was when it came to thinking about and imagining what freedom really means. And so I think those are the kind of spaces that I would like to take the march. And those were the kind of big ideas that were on my mind as I was working on the book and then writing it.
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.